second session of the symposium. It's going to be, this session is going to be on how child's well-being can be impacted by both the natural and built environments. And the first speaker of the session is going to be Dr. Annie Belcourt. She's a professor in the College of Health at the University of Montana, and she also serves there as the chair of Native American Studies. Her talk title is going to be Indigenous Resiliency, Developing Ikaakiimaat.
Okay, Nistu Nataniko Amanisiaki. So my name is Annie Belcourt, or Otter Woman, and I come to you today from the Blackfeet Nation as well as the Mandan Hidatsa Nation in Montana. And I'm just thrilled to be here to talk to each of you and to really talk about some of this incredible work, and not to quote Monty Python, but it's going to be something a little entirely different than some of what you've heard this morning. We'll be talking about one of the things I'm really passionate about, which is resiliency. And Indigenous resiliency for our Blackfeet people, one of the ways that we talk about it is the term Ikaakiimaat. And Ikaakiimaat is trying hard. And it's a cultural kind of sentiment that we use to describe the ways that we have been resilient throughout the years. And I wanted to start this talk today and talk with you about work that's been supported by the JPB Foundation as part of my role as a fellow with the JPB Harvard Foundation on Environmental Public Health Fellowship. I grew up on the Blackfeet Reservation, which is, if you've been to Montana, it's by Glacier National Park. We actually grew up 6 miles outside of that. We have land right outside of the park. But this quote, I thought, was very fitting. I read this morning from a relative of ours who's a Blackfeet language instructor at one of our schools, our immersion schools. And it reads, "Every Blackfoot person alive today is here because of warriors like this. We are not only the products of trauma and boarding schools, we are the products of survivors, the ones who never quit. We are products of warriors, medicine people, and chiefs. So remember that the next time you feel like quitting and giving up. Remember that in order for us to be here, our ancestors had to fight and adapt. We are the prayers in living form. And remember, being Piikani means never giving up." And so that's part of what I'll be talking with you all about today. His name is Jesse DeRozier. He served in the U.S. Marine Corps in Iraq and Afghanistan, and he is like many of our people, had struggled with many other things, teaches our children how to learn our culture and our language, and that's a lot of what we'll be talking about. And how do we instill resiliency and create bonds that help our communities recover from some of the things that I'll talk about with regard to challenges within our communities. And so, as we talk about this, whoops, maybe. I wanted to share a photo. This is something that I've really had a wonderful opportunity to dive into our Native history. I was a double major in Native American Studies and psychology back in the day before becoming a clinical psychologist. And this photo is a photo of one of our ancestors, and his name is Chief Bull. And so he talks about the need for, and this was back in the early 1900s, our Native people to have cultural reclamation and the need for our education to be shared more widely. And so that's part of what this talk represents, is our ability to speak for and with our communities in a way that we can really think about, to quote Martin Luther King, the urgency of now. And that's something that we think about very much when we think about American Indian Alaska Native health. We know that we have systemic problems that face our communities. And as you've heard about this morning, those forms of problems require systemic solutions. And that's part of what we're advocating for as scholars in Indigenous sciences, is part of what we think about also is the stars. So for many of our Native people, our wayfinding, our creation stories are linked to the star stories that we share. At the university where I work at, we have a planetarium that I've learned to run. And the reason a psychologist is running a planetarium, right, is because, this is the ways that we learn who we are. that hasn't been allowed for Native people for many hundreds of years. Our ceremonies were outlawed until 1978. I was born in 1974, so when I was born, it was illegal for us to participate in our ceremonies and to speak our languages. So when we think about Ikaakiimaat, we think about resiliency, it is within a narrative of resistance and one of reclamation, and that's where our children are, and how they develop is in a time and a space that is not highlighting their lives. It's not valuing their lives equally. And that's one of the things that we are so concerned with. Why we lead with history and why I agreed to become chair of Native American Studies is for these reasons. This is not the first pandemic that Native people have experienced. We've had biologic, social, economic, all of these different areas of essentially attack on our communities and our populations. And what has developed in terms of child development is that we have essentially learned how to hate ourselves. And that's a really tragic, horrible thing for our children. We have the highest suicide rate of any community in the nation. And that is unacceptable to me as a clinician. When we think about external factors, we think about sustained discrimination that our communities continue to face. We're overrepresented in the prison population, in the foster care system, you name it. In Montana, we see inequities in terms of our economy, our political folks. We now see legislation that's attacking our transgender children. We have a lot of really complex and interrelated problems that impact our communities very directly. This is true when we think about language, culture, and lack of access to care. In Montana, even in a more urban area like I live in Missoula, you cannot access care for children, especially if it's cognitive behavioral care. We have one or two psychiatrists for the entire, 100,000 plus area of need. And as you can see from the pandemic this morning, we've talked about this has really had a high impact on the mental health of all of our communities. And as we think about this, it's important. It's equally as important to think about our strengths. And so this photo is from last spring, which is my first Native doctoral graduate from our campus who, Deshane Barnett, finished his doctoral degree in public health. And so symbolic of the ways that our strengths and our ways really will sustain us. And then he just taught for us this year on spirituality and public health. And so we're really excited that this is part of what we see. So as a Native American Studies person, I also include in here, this is a very crazy short slide that is Native American history, right? So we think about our communities. We have a traumatic and sudden population loss that was due to many things, including disease, starvation, genocide, and then discrimination that we continue to experience. We've had relocation. If you know our history, we have had basically, it was legal in Montana to be hunted as Native people. We have so eradication, subjugation, and then ultimately termination, where reservations and tribes were terminated, and that is continuing to be a risk for many people. So then you see a developmental outcome, which is cycle of violence towards the self in particular. And so for our children wake up each day and have a lot of, we talk about ACE scores, very, very true for our Native communities. And we see a lot of outcomes that are detrimental that we've reviewed this morning. So cultural resistance is something that I am very interested in for a number of reasons. One of them is that as Native people, we really are wanting a dignity-based approach to our healthcare. We want to have the hope infused within the options that are presented to us, but we want them to be developed by and for Native communities. And when we think about cultural preservation, language, revitalization, and healing, those are intertwined with our identity. And as we know from the literature in psychology, identity is a really important factor if you want to help people become resilient and not to succumb to things like substance abuse or suicidality. So community, education, and the ways that we're interdependent really help to kind of foster some of those factors. And spirituality is a meaning-making factor, and as a clinician, when we look at PTSD, it's a disorder oftentimes conceptualized as a disorder of memory, right? We think about memory being something that becomes fragmented when we've had trauma. And so some of our best psychotherapies are ones that we look at habituation, right? The goal is exposure and response prevention, and over time to getting people to feel a sense of sort of redemptive meaning that's associated with trauma, as opposed to having a real negative view of that. And so these photos, this is a photo from an encampment this last summer that I was able to attend, and one of the things that we see there is we see naming ceremonies, we see face painting ceremonies, we see a lot of community restoral around language and all the different factors associated with ceremony. So this is a critical question that I face as a scholar and a clinician in this area, is how do we look at these questions that are really very difficult and that have the systemic kind of aspect to them. When we think about scientific equity and we think about reaching those who are most at risk for some of these difficult questions and topics. So not everybody wants to lead with, how do we stop suicide? How do we stop missing and murdered Indigenous women? Those are really difficult topics, and they really require a lot of bravery. And a lot of the survivor community is really asked for that, balancing needs for dignity with an emphasis on strength-based approaches. And so looking at healing and health in this very kind of balanced way, and we think about moderation. So, and this came from a nurse who works with some of our Blackfeet children, and this is a photo of Mountain Chief, who's one of our historical chiefs. There's a whole history there. But if we expect our children to be brave and to report or to speak for safety and ask for safety, we as adults and we as scientists have to be brave too. And those are really difficult conversations for many of us to be engaged with. When we think about Montana, I just wanted to orient you to where some of my work has taken place with JPB. Montana is a geographically isolated state. We have very few providers and things, but we have 7 reservations in our community, and those are many of the different tribal communities that are native to Montana, and are Indigenous people. And this is a list of some of the names of our tribal communities in Montana, and I won't go through each pronunciation because I'm not very good at that. But but Ikaakiimaat is where I came from, and you can see that while we're small relatively to the state of Montana, 6 to 7%, we make up much of the cultural diversity for our state, and we also experience much of the health disparities within our state. And so the next slide I'll talk with you about is a little bit of those disparities, and this is coming from like a whole course. We can talk about all the different disparities in health and things, but one of the things that's helpful to think about is this bottom row here is the state of Montana, and this is a little bit of older data, so it's pre-pandemic. But if you compare poverty indices and kind of so-called built, socioeconomic factors, we see a systematic difference when you compare each of our reservations to other citizens of our state. That is quite dramatic, for all of our communities. And so with that context in mind, we think about violence and exposure, and we think about adverse childhood experiences. For American Indian people, that is the norm, unfortunately. We have more people experiencing very clinically significant violence within their lifetimes. We have some gender differences, but we also have issues of sexual predation. This is really complicated when you have reservations where we can't always prosecute those who have, enacted these crimes for many reasons. But because of that, we've had predators actually move to our reservations to prey on our children and our communities. And so these are really significant problems. When we think about resiliency and we think about culture as a protective factor, one of the things that we have been able to start to look at is the ways that culture protects and heals communities in very real ways. One of the studies that I was a part of and that was funded through the JPB Foundation, we found that those who participated in ceremonies for the Blackfeet people were less likely to have depression symptoms elevated. And that's still given the exposure. They were still experiencing the exposure to trauma and traumatic events. One of the other things is participation in what we call the Okan, which is our medicine lodge, or you may have heard it as Sundance kind of ceremony. Those folks who participated in that ceremony specifically were more likely to report highly protective factors. And that translated to decreased risk of depression, anxiety, PTSD, those sorts of things. And that's a really important factor. Those interrelate very closely for Native people to our environmental factors and how healthy our land is, because we still continue to gather plant medicines for food, for things like teas, what we call smudge, which is like our prayer ceremonies, and many of those different things that are highly interrelated. Our creation stories and our meaning stories, the past couple of years in being chair as Native American Studies, I've been able to really appreciate the ways that those are living beings within our lives as Native people, the way that we think about our lives and how that's tied to place and land. And so those things are very much important for our health. I think I might have skipped a slide, sorry. I don't know what happened there. I think I did. Okay, yeah, sorry. So this is a little bit about the study that was done with the Blackfeet. I'm calling it the Ikaakiimaat study. And then what we're looking at is we had 380 people who we sampled for this study. We developed a brand new measure of environmental exposure for Indigenous communities. And that measure is composed of two different scales. One is environmental exposures that you might think of as with rapid climate change, like heat, major storms. 2 days ago, we had a funnel cloud on the Mission Mountains, which has never happened in anybody's historic memory. Just to show you a sense of the rapid, extreme climate change factors that we see in our areas. We're under a flood warning right now because there's trees coming down the river, because there was so much snow this winter that it's causing this real, desperate situation in many ways for our environment. So we also included a social stressor scale, which looked at drug exposures, looked at violence exposures within the community. And this was because the community really demanded that we include that piece and look at that factor. And we looked at the relationship to health, mental health, culture, and resiliency. We also looked at some biomarkers for the sample, for half of the sample, and we looked at things like A1C levels, as well as we looked at hypertension, BMI, those sorts of factors. And one of the things that we found, I'll come back to that, but anecdotally, some of the folks who were probable, diabetics, did not know that they had very, very high blood sugar screens for their A1Cs, and so we had to refer them. Thankfully, we had a referral process so that we could get people the care that they needed. And then we also have looked at some of the qualitative ethnographic work that I'm kind of alluding to, but it's some of that is asking people within the community, but also I myself going to ceremonies and learning from people within our community about what are the factors that are restorative and healing, which has really been an incredible opportunity for me. But basically, one of the things we saw is that culture matters, right? And that's not a shocking statement, but for our people, this has been something that has not been looked at in terms of the science. And when we saw the things that matter specifically, learning our language And our language is a verb-based language, so even for most of us have names that, they're like English language is very noun-based, and like the cat went over the tree. And for the Blackfeet, it's more like running eagle falls and the different kinds of things, and that's how we name and think about things. So that shapes development and how children think about their world and how they think about like how they have different goals for their trajectory and lifetime trajectories as well. So 30% attended a lot of the ceremonies that we have in our community, and this is a very big change in my lifetime, right? When my parents ran a ceremony in 1970, there were very few people there. There were people from within our tribe who wanted to burn it down, and that's not an exaggeration. And so when we think about these specific events, has really happened following the pandemic as well. We've had people really resurge in their interest in these areas. So when we think about what can be done, we think about some of the different areas of I've mentioned ceremony, but also storytelling, and we're an oral history, community, and so these things really are intertwined with culture and language, as I've mentioned. But our economies have also been very decimated, and following the pandemic, this is particularly true. When we think about educational opportunities and housing, one of the things I wanted to mention was with regard to the pandemic. I don't know what happened with I'm going to go back to this because I don't know what's happening with the pandemic has impacted American Indian communities very significantly, right? And so you may or may not have seen this, but when we see the black line for both morbidity and mortality, that's American Indian Alaska Natives. And one of the things that you may have seen in the media coverage of the pandemic is that our communities were less likely to have running water. We're more likely to be overcrowded, sometimes didn't have power in any kind of way. Some of the studies that I've been involved with have looked at wood stove use and looking at indoor air quality being very poor within our communities. And this was prior to the pandemic. And all these things mapped on, as we know, to worse outcomes for the pandemic. And when we saw that, we saw the, sorry. I'm catching up. We see the risk finding that is associated with the study I shared. So we see depression and PTSD associated with environmental exposures. And again, this was collected prior to the pandemic, so I'd like to go back and collect some of the same sort of data following the pandemic to see how this has kind of changed. And then with regard to the biomarkers, at the time, we didn't really see statistically significant relationships other than hypertension, and that people who had hypertension symptoms by the screen, right, they had, that was moderated by community support. And so that was a really important factor. So we saw some statistical interesting findings with regard to these things. So when we think about poor health and we think about culture and protective factors, this is something that we kind of consider as being, not just like good news. This is really actually things that are helping the community. And when we think about development and for our discussions today, development's very much shaped by culture, and for Native people, we haven't always had the access to that, right? I was at a meeting where one of our administrators for our campus came in, and happened to be Ash Wednesday, and I didn't realize this, right? And we have a lot of Catholic religious folks within our community, and he came in and had ashes on his forehead, and it was great, right? I was like, oh, that's really cool. But then I realized, like, when would Native people ever have that similar level of access, where we could be at a meeting and it would be commonplace for them to have access to their spiritual and religious practices? And the answer is we don't. And those who are working to increase access for those things, are interested in the development of our community's health as well as our children's health. And so, another study that was done looking at the tribal college universities, this is just a subset of that sample. So they have over 3,000 different folks who've been sampled within this study. But this is specific to our Blackfeet community in Montana. But what they looked at is ACE scores, and we saw, what you might expect. Depression, suicidal ideation, PTSD, all related to higher ACE scores for the sample. But the other thing that they looked at was everyday discrimination, which speaks to lateral violence. And so that's where I mentioned, the self-hatred. So people kind of within the community treating each other poorly. Sometimes we call it crabs in the bucket or different kinds of things. We see a lot of internalized strife and a lot of violence that happens. And then that really very importantly impacts our children and how they view themselves. So I wanted to talk just briefly about the service needs. I've mentioned some of the systemic ways that we can look at these factors. But then also I wanted to share with you a story because I'm a story person. But when we talk about the Blackfeet, we have Napi stories, which are like trickster stories, if you're familiar with those kinds of things. And that's sort of like how not to live. For the Blackfeet, we also have stories of Blackfeet superhero, who is Kutoyes, and then we also have a story of the wolf trail, and that's what I kind of summarize here a little bit. And really the key to the story is that for our survival, it requires everybody working together. And from all the way up to our elders, to our youngest people, everybody had a role within that. And so our elders are really encouraging us to think about that as we think about healing at the community level. And how do we have some of the ways that we can live by the principles that were shared within some of our stories. And so we have a Blackfeet word for compassion, and that's one of the things that's been shared with me as being an important factor. And so looking at language and culture is a big part of that, but also place. How do we have place-based education? How do we have the things that we know from our community? And how can we live by these different principles? And the Makoyi is our wolf trail stories, and the compassion that we share as communities and as people. How do we begin to really embrace that? So this is something that I think we're all kind of thinking about, is compassion fatigue, and how do we look at post-traumatic growth in this era, and how do we communicate different ways of supporting each other. Many people throughout the country, but especially for our BIPOC folks, are feeling very low in terms of the tank of emotional support and need. As psychologists, we think about some of the kind of ways that we can look at internal dialogue and to reduce lateral violence. So these are some of the things that we work with folks on. And then when we think about reframing, this is really essentially cognitive behavioral therapy distilled very crassly, but our thoughts impact our emotions, and that impacts our actions. Basic things as that, when we can share those kind of principles with our children, really can make a difference. And the same things that are talked about today are some of the ways that we can weave and instill public health. And acceptance is part of that. Acceptance is ways that we think about practicing positive self-talk, reframing some of the negative narratives that have been shared with us and with other community members. And then I wanted to wrap up with just an idea of, we started to do some clinical trial work around narrative exposure therapy as a way that you could use paraprofessionals to help with some of this work on trauma therapy. And basically one of the things in narrative exposure therapy that we do is you work with creating a lifeline with folks, and that includes positive and traumatic experiences, and then you go back through and you process each of these events, and that's a way of increasing habituation to those traumatic events and helping people heal. And so the similar things with trauma-informed systems, right? We think about how do we weave trauma therapy or trauma principles into our systems and then reduce symptoms. We have to think about reducing inequity, and that's just a given. We have to reduce stigma that is facing our communities and our children, and then we have to improve access. So this is just kind of a fun part, but I'll end here. But when we think about film and media right now, we're supporting our Writers Guild strike because this is the first time in the history that we've finally started to have representation for Natives in media. And that's a really important thing for us as we think about storytelling, we think about popular imagery of our communities. And that's really kind of informing the next steps as we think about investing and empowering what I'm calling resiliency, you know, because I'm that way, I'm from the res. But as we think about healing and diversifying science and academia, I have a personal hero. His name is Nina Bixi. He's Mike Brewstead. He's 72 years old. He just finished his PhD last year. He flew in a helicopter to the top of a mountain in Waterton in Canada, renamed the mountain, and now is holding pipe ceremonies at that spot with our children, you know. And so those are really helpful and really hopeful stories when we think about investing in place and growing into health. And that is something that we're seeing within our students, our diversity within our students. And Ikaakiimaat is you know, a principle that we're continuing to live. This is a photo of my great-great-great-grandmother, and she actually survived the Bear River Massacre. And that was for those historians who are interested. But she walked, you know, 70 miles to safety after, you know, many of her family and friends were killed. They had over 200 Blackfeet killed. And so these are the folks who, all of our Native people are survivors, you know, and we're like their legacy, really. And so we think about that miracle survivor. This is what we're talking about. So I wanted to end here. It's not data heavy today, it's more philosophical around the needs for our communities to have these like areas of scientific inquiry like really looked at and understood. This is just many thanks to the many partners, including the JPB Foundation and all the folks at Harvard who have helped our mentorship and develop. And I also just one of our JPB mentors was one of my lifelong mentors, David Schulberg. And so when my children were very young, I started grad school, and they couldn't pronounce Schulberg, so they always called him Bluebird. And he recently passed and had been a sudden illness, but this is just a little tribute to him and all the work that he's done to help encourage this idea of strength-based, because I've been working on this since 1999, like looking at resiliency, looking at how we can inform trauma therapy in ways that is inclusive of diverse voices and communities. So, so with that, I wanted to just thank you all and encourage you to just think about Natives too when you're thinking about some of the science piece, because oftentimes we are included as like other, and within other, there's a lot of diversity and there's a lot of need for clinical care that we can think about in terms of our science as well. So thank you very much. Sure. So the question is about scientific inequity? Scientific equity. So, yeah, for sure. So science equity, I think, is a really multifaceted topic for sure. But part of it is like making sure I am a volunteer reviewer for our Blackfeet Nation IRB. And one of the things that we see is that many times our communities are not provided the benefits of science. So a lot of times we're studied, and there's what we call helicopter research. People come in, collect their data, and never disseminate the findings where they need to be, which is really back to the community so that they can actually intervene and have data-informed grant applications or things like that for service. And so when we think about scientific equity, it's really extending the reach of what we do scientifically in ways that people can understand. And that's also like publications. Like we're trained to make sure that we have things graphically understandable for communities so that we're not using a ton of jargon and those sorts of things. But that invites people in, because there's a lot of cultural norms about fear or, you know, really fear, but not wanting to ask too many questions. So people just sort of like accept things, and they may not understand what happened, and they may not even have access to the article, as we know, to read about what happened within their communities. So a lot of it is kind of surrounding those factors as well, but I hope that's helpful. Oh, sure.
You talked a lot about narrative and internalization. Is it beneficial in the healing process to externalize colonialism and the pathology of that, or is it more beneficial to focus on positive culture?
I think like with all things, I was trained as a clinician, so everything's moderation. So I think like within the context of framing like these are things that happened to us that were wrong, and that's like very much true. But reclaiming the strength that we have had within that, and then looking at some of our ceremonial ways as a way to like, because we've had with NAGPRA and different things where we've had to like reclaim some of the remains that we've had ancestors taken from us. We've had to recreate ceremonies. We create new ceremonies, and so that's part of what we're doing now is we're creating ceremonies for folks who've experienced really difficult things, including those who are in recovery or who've experienced assaults of different kinds. So it's a dynamic cultural kind of shift in those ways. So it's really kind of both acknowledging the past, but then looking to the future